Good afternoon. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator for Clay and Owen counties. Today is the first in our three-session program, the Fall Pond Workshop. Today's session is going to be on managing weeds on the water. Now, when we talk about weeds in ponds, we talk about a variety of plants, some of them more familiar than others. There are going to be 5 primary weeds that you're going to be dealing with. For the purposes of this program, we're only going to be really focusing on 3 of them. And those are going to be algae, free-floating plants, and rooted floating plants. Now, the differences between all weeds that you see on this list are going to be whether or not they do some kind of flowering, whether they breach the surface of the water. If they have a root structure, what form does that root structure take? The depth the weeds occupy in the water, i.e., are they sitting on top of the water? Do they swim freely through the water column? Are they rooted throughout the water column? And lastly, the closeness to the shoreline. Now, the first of these weed species that I want to talk about today, or rather weed group, is algae. This is perhaps the most common problem found in ponds, though it's important to keep in mind that algae serves many purposes. Now, algae are very simple, non-flowering plants. They are typically single-celled life forms, and when we see them gathered together, they form a kind of colony that can take several different forms, either a kind of scummy covering over the surface of the water, maybe it turns the water different colors, or it can even form long filaments. As you can see, I mentioned that sometimes this is referred to as pond scum because they leave this telltale oily sheen on the surface of the water if they're in a more single-celled form. If they're not, they'll often form a mossy patch over large portions of the water's surface, and sometimes these mats can be so thick you could almost walk across them. Our first group of algae that we want to talk about are going to be our microscopic algae. These are our single-celled or maybe just a smaller colonial life form that forms up the phytoplankton or the plant life forms in the pond. This typically acts as a source of food for fish, insects, and other organisms. So when we talk about algae, it's important to keep in mind that while many of us will see it as a weed or something that discolors our water, this is actually incredibly important if you want to maintain an ecosystem that you're going to derive a service from. For instance, if you plan on doing fishing, this is going to form the basement of the food web that's taking place in your pond. Smaller organisms will eat the algae, which in turn will get eaten by the fish. When this becomes a problem, most often people notice that the pond water will turn green. Now, when this happens, though, in the case of your general green algae, the color of the water will appear to be more under the surface. Think of looking at a container of Kool-Aid you just mixed. It's not like the Kool-Aid is sitting on top in the pitcher, it's more in the water column itself. The other important thing to keep in mind is you don't want pristine, clear water, especially if you're trying to husband a group of fish that you want to take advantage of in the water. Clear water means there are no nutrients, there are no materials for those fish and other organisms to eat. Another group of algae that is referred to as blue-green algae is actually also called cyanobacteria. Now, this instance of algae has an important difference with green algae. This is a toxic species. If you stepped into water that contains a blue-green algae outbreak, you may get kind of sick. Any animals or cattle or other livestock that come into contact with this water are taking a chance. Oftentimes, blue-green algae blooms can kill livestock and companion animals. You can tell when blue-green algae is present because it can sit below the water, like the Kool-Aid example I gave, and on top of the water. Often, when I'm talking with my clients, I'll refer to it looking like someone dumped green paint on the surface of your pond. You'll also notice a very distinct smell. Your pond will get a kind of sewage smell that will stand out very strongly. Now, blue-green algae has a unique feature compared to other algal species. It can clear on its own. What'll happen is the algae will develop and take advantage of the nutrients in the pond, and eventually they'll overpopulate on their own and burn out the population. You'll see your pond clear. However, this does not mean it's safe. When these algae die, the reason they're so dangerous is not that they excrete a toxin. Rather, they contain one within their bodies, in their single-celled bodies. And when they die and those bodies break open, the toxins are then released into the water. So there's still an effective danger there. While there are different ways of managing this, the best way is most likely to reduce the runoff entering into your pond. And we're going to talk about runoff a little more in the next session of our program. The most visible and probably the most complained about form of algae is what is often referred to as horsehair algae. Now, this is that filamentous type of algae that I mentioned just a little bit ago. This will form a very thick mat that is very difficult to remove through physical labor. It can easily spread across large sections of your pond during the right conditions. I will often get calls where clients will be asking what to do right after a period of high heat that has come after a period of high wetness. Nutrients have been transported due to storms and other activities, and large amounts of heat and sunlight give the perfect conditions for this algae to develop and grow. And like I said, this is very difficult to remove. It requires, most likely, the best is a combination of physical and chemical removal methods. So what are some of those methods? Well, the one that most people are going to focus on primarily are going to be those chemical methods. And for algal management, we're talking about copper sulfates, copper chelates, and a few other chemicals. Copper sulfate and copper chelates are perhaps the most common. Now, I want to preface this with one statement. If you choose to use chemical control methods, please read the label and follow those directions. Only a small amount of these substances will do the work you need it to do. And no matter what, most chemical control methods will have some impact, either greater or lesser, on any population of fish. Follow those label directions and you can control that effect. Mechanical means of removal usually are done with seine nets and rakes, but I will warn you, this is not a one-person job. You will need help to do this. It is backbreaking labor and it is very difficult. People have often referred to using biological control methods to control algae. What they often are referring to is the use of grass carp, believing that grass carp will consume the algae in the pond. Please do not use grass carp. This is an Asian species. It is invasive, and due to their introduction into our environment, they have spread across many areas of Indiana. You'll often see videos on YouTube of someone in a boat and you see fish just flying right out of the water into the boat. These are Asian carp. The bad thing about Asian carp too is often they don't do the job that you think they will. They may not necessarily eat the algae that you want them to. More likely, they're going to push out all the other fish in the pond and reduce its overall quality. Please, do not use grass carp. Now, our next group of plants that we're going to focus on are our free-floating plants. These are plants that are not rooted into any kind of soil substrate. They have roots that may float in the water if they have them. They are also very, very easily spread by animal activity such as migratory birds. Now, in addition to being spread by that activity, we also act as a contaminating agent in this story. When we take our boats out to different ponds, if there is a free-floating plant species available, it'll stick to the hull of our boats, and if we don't clean them appropriately, we can then transmit them into the next body of water we put our boat into. It's important to make sure that you monitor this. These species are very, very capable of spreading across an entire surface, and sometimes, while they may look pretty, they're actually doing a terrible job of helping your pond by blocking sunlight and reducing dissolved oxygen. One species that's fairly well known of free-floating plants is the species known as duckweed. And you can see that in this image here with several very tiny duckweed plants surrounding a water shield. These tiny plants will sit on the surface of the water, and if you look closely, you will find that there actually is a single root extending from the edge of the plant. Like I said, they easily block sunlight given the fact that they spread very quickly. All they're doing is just covering that surface and soaking up that sun so they can keep reproducing. Another species that we talk about, which is perhaps even worse than duckweed, is a species called watermeal. This image actually tells a great story. Look very closely at it. You can see that there's actually duckweed in this pond. Those are the larger green shapes that you can look at here. The smaller ones are the actual watermeal plants. Now, these are very, very tiny. You can fit dozens of them on the space of a dime. But the difference between them and duckweed is that they lack a root structure. They don't need one. Their body is actually fairly absorbent and it lets water permeate through it, so they don't need a root to help them get nutrients and water into it. These are very, very nasty in that they're so tiny, they're difficult to remove, so that means that they spread very easily on animals, on humans when we move through the water in our clothing, and on our boats. So how are we going to try to manage these species? Well, first we want to eliminate the influx of nutrients coming into our pond. There's that runoff subject again, and we're going to talk about that some more. You may want to consider draining a pond if the nutrient content is so high that you get continuous redevelopment of duckweed, watermeal, and other plants. Chemical methods that are available include dicot. Please note that dicot has been outlawed in the European Union, but it is still labeled for use in the United States. Normally, what I would recommend is the use of a chemical known as fluoridone, which will work to get rid of these plants. As always, please read your label directions on any chemicals you put in your pond. Now on to our last set of plants we're going to talk about today, our rooted floating plants. These will include some of the plants that you'll consider the prettiest, but unfortunately they have very similar deleterious effects on your pond as the free-floating plants do. This will include water lilies, water shield, spatterdock, and American pondweed. Oftentimes these plants will actually have flowers. They will pop up on the water as you see in this image with water lilies. And they'll use what's referred to as a rhizome, which will be under the ground of the sediment. This is kind of like a root structure, except instead of spreading and absorbing water, it actually connects one plant to another plant, making it a single organism. So all of the water lilies you see here may actually be a single organism with multiple rhizomes connecting them. Water shield is another example of this. This one, you'll note, does look different from the water lilies in the previous image. They're certainly not nearly as pretty. And of course, American pondweed. Now you could tell the difference between American pondweed and the other plants that we've mentioned because you can see very clearly the leaf shape is much different. It has a longer, more slender leaf, and it also has a very clear rooted structure. You can tell that there's a stem going straight down, and if you were to try to remove this, you would probably find it fairly challenging because there's this thick stem leading from an individual leaf downwards, and it's all grouped together in a mass, kind of like how difficult horsehair algae would be to remove. Spatterdock, while not a plant that I personally dealt with very often in problems that I've seen in my area, does kind of resemble water shields and water lilies, and you can also tell when spatterdock is present due to the presence of yellow flowers. Now, how are we going to manage these plants? Usually, there are a variety of products available that can be used to treat these plants. Typically, you'll often see suggestions to use something involving 2,4-D and a few other compounds. But what I would personally suggest is if you have this as a problem, contact your local extension office and we can give you advice that's probably a little bit better crafted to an individual problem that you may be facing there. The reason for this is that a lot of these plants are valuable to wildlife. Your fish, your frogs, a lot of different insect species, and other creatures that are going to be around need these plants to form habitat. And while I understand if you're wanting to get rid of them because you're expecting a certain recreational activity, a certain appearance, or get a certain use out of your pond, if you want to maintain the value there, say if you want to go fishing, Or if you want to have fun in the pond in a pretty place, you're going to want that wildlife, and some of these plants are important to that. So before you choose to manage this on your own, give your extension office a call. We're more than willing to help you out. All right, with that, I'm just going to leave my contact information here. This was a very abbreviated program, so I would be more than happy to hear your questions and get your input. Please feel free to call me at the number shown here or email me at my email. And I look forward to seeing you all at our next program, Why is My Pond Green?